Welcome to Curated Cinema, a series where I select a group of films in such a way as to explore a larger theme. This episode's theme is omniscience. What would the omniscient do? Often this question is the premise of many philosophical thought experiments. What is the relationship between omniscience and choice? How does someone who knows everything make meaningful choices? Let us explore this idea through the omniscient hero trope in film. I want to take a minute and talk about why I'm doing this. Primarily, this is a passion project of mine. I want to become a more active viewer and greater my appreciation of film. Hopefully, in the process, I can deepen some others' appreciation as well. While making this, I've already learned so much, and I know I still have a lot to learn, but I think that's one of the great things about film. It's so broad and eclectic. There are multiple individual facets of it that people put their whole lives into, and I certainly don't see myself getting bored with this. Also, there's something to be said about utilizing a beginner's mind to procure a fresh perspective. I hope you would trust me not to do a video essay unless I have something new and interesting to say. Also, I want to celebrate the films I love, not criticize the movies that I don't. I feel it's important not to forget the reason you started something, because after you've started it, it can often take on a life of its own. In my deep dive for interviews for this project, I found a video with like 300 views. In it, the directing duo The Daniels explain a Japanese concept called ikigai. Now, while this concept's pretty difficult to distill down to a brief description, it's somewhat easily described by using a 4-direction Venn diagram, with the different sections being what you love, what you're good at, what the world needs, and what you can be paid for. At the cross-section of these 4 is the concept of ikigai. It's about finding meaning, purpose, and fulfillment in your work. Another facet of ikigai that isn't represented by this diagram is the fact that your work should fuel you. You become immersed in it and energized by it. And that's very much the feeling I've had while making this, and it's something that I hope will continue. When you think of omniscience concerning film, you probably first think of a crazy or insane side character who influences the plot in some way to help move things along. I think the Oracle in The Matrix or Griffin from Men in Black 3, who I'll bring up briefly a little bit later, but that's not what I'm interested in. What I'm more interested in is the omniscient hero trope, where the protagonists themselves are omniscient. Some examples of this would be Lucy from that movie that thinks we only use 10% of our brain. I would also consider Dr. Manhattan, or even Doctor Strange, at least in Infinity War. I had a difficult time finding a cohesive list of all the characters who display some signs of omniscience, so list the ones that I missed in the comments, and it'll be interesting to see how they relate to the argument that I make here. Also, one thing to note, when I'm talking about omniscience, I'm referring to it in a sort of limited fashion. Maybe prescience or clairvoyance might be more appropriate terminology. I mean, the definition of omniscience itself is going to cause issues. The state of knowing everything. Doesn't the one who knows the most, at least from an outside perspective, know everything? Each movie deals with it in its own way, and I'll be discussing each later. But for the sake of this, think of omniscience not as a binary condition, but more of a gradient. I'm primarily going to be talking about 3 films: Everything Everywhere All at Once, Arrival, and Mr. Nobody. So this is the part of the video where I was going to stop, warn you about spoilers, and tell you to go watch the movies first. But actually, I think I have an interesting idea. I want to start a collective experiment. If you haven't seen the films yet, watch this video first, and I'll explain the plot so far as is necessary for you to understand what I'm talking about. The question I want to pose is, does knowing how the story ends influence your enjoyment of it? What better opportunity to have this discussion than a video about omniscience? Just embrace the irony of watching a video about omniscience without having prior knowledge of the films I'm referencing. It could be an interesting exploration of the story. In Everything Everywhere All at Once, some of the characters experience the multiverse. This allows them to access alternate realities where they can acquire unique abilities and intricate knowledge. For example, like the location for a secret button for Doomsday Shelter Toy Dungeon. Yeah, this movie is weird. There are 2 main characters we're going to focus on, Jobu and Evelyn, played by Stephanie Sue and Michelle Yeoh. When the movie starts, we see a pretty normal family and their mundane struggles. There are immigrant owners of a laundromat in the midst of a tax audit. There's one universe where the omniscience originates. They call it the Alphaverse, and their name for it is verse jumping. In this universe, in a quest for power, Evelyn pushed her daughter until she couldn't take it anymore, and she broke. Eventually, succumbing to the nihilism created out of omniscience, she made a manifestation of nihilism itself, the everything bagel, a black hole that consumes more than light and matter. Jobu made the bagel hoping it would end her suffering and lead to her self-destruction. The Alphaverse then sent the alpha version of Ki Hoi Kwan's character Waymond first jumping. We can only assume he experiences a similar level of omniscience, yet he's motivated by this goal to find an Evelyn with an eclectic set of interests, but who has failed at everything and is living her worst life, which is incredibly relatable, I might add. Alpha Waymond has this theory that because she's failed at so many different things, she would have access to the largest number of universes, thinking she would then be the most powerful and be able to kill Jobu. However, his perspective is flawed. It's cold and it's apathetic. At one point, he just gives up on Evelyn, presumably leaving her to die, and I couldn't help but wonder, how many other times has he done this? How many other universes has he gone through and left a path of destruction in his wake? He even at one point mentions something about a burner universe, as if there were some universes that mattered less than others. Once Jobu and Evelyn come into contact with each other though, Jobu's full range of power is put on display. She is able to manipulate her surroundings, even displaying signs of omnipotence. Ultimately, in their clash against one another that spans across multiple dimensions simultaneously, Evelyn learns from the regular old prime women that even if nothing makes sense, it's important to be kind. The score by Sunlock swells, and Ki Hoi Kwan gives one of the most evocative performances I have ever seen. Evelyn is enlightened, and she empathy fights her way through a crowd of people, helping them each along the way. It's around this point that the movie takes a huge risk, and imbues hot dog fingers and rocks with googly eyes with enough emotional impact that it has brought me to tears multiple times. The Sunlock score swells again as it turns into an amalgamation of everything we've heard so far. Evelyn lets Jobu surrender herself to the nihilism bagel, only for Joy to reach out at the last second and they're able to pull her back out. Throughout this whole ordeal, Evelyn has a realization that even though she has access to omniscience and a million other lives, she chooses the one where she, like Michelle Yeoh says,
this is the woman that you pass by on the streets and you never notice her.
But she has a family that she loves. The directors actually do a pretty good job of describing this movie themselves, and I would like to add that here.
If it was an essay, we're like, our film is trying to say, like, look, the first half is a chosen one, the Matrix style hero's journey, and the second half is just completely a refracting explosion of that story. It's you are no one, you know. Yeah, it's like we are all no one, and yet maybe that there's still something worth holding on to there.
There's one scene that's an homage to In the Mood for Love. As Daniel Scheinhardt says,
this is a movie we ripped off for our movie. Aesthetically, we just did it again.
It's an excellent movie by Wong Kar-wai that's definitely worth a watch. But fun fact,
Ki Kwan, who plays Waymond in our movie, worked for Wong Kar-wai for years. Wong Kar-wai introduced him to his now wife.
Echo Kwan worked on the set as a translator for this movie. And I find that the story about how she got the job especially interesting.
We read through the whole script for the first time. It's literally less than a week before we start shooting because of schedules. We have no time to rehearse. This is the first time we're all in the same space. And the moment we're done, Ki's wife, Echo Kwan, who just so happened to stay up all night the night before translating the script for us without our permission. She just did it because she's like
adjusting the translations and stuff.
Yeah, she read the first pass of our translation. She's like, this is not good. We can do better. Yeah, exactly. And she came up to us and was like, this script has a very powerful soul. And we're like, okay. And it's so powerful, it is sucking in all these other strong souls, and together we're gonna make something very, very special. It's gonna be very successful all around the world. and
right, all right, Echo.
Okay, Echo, thank you. Goodbye. And you know, she has a very spiritual way of looking at the world, and she filtered that into our process. Like, she brought that spirituality onto our set. Her words have stuck with me ever since the movie came out, because I'm like, of course she was right. She knew way before any of us. We were making fun of her, and she was right the whole time.
From what I heard, she's the embodiment of the Waymond worldview, and I just wanted to take a second to highlight her. Also, this comment is so wholesome, and I love it. In Arrival, the main character Louise, played by Amy Adams, is a linguistics professor. She's called in by the military amid first contact to translate an alien language. The movie focuses on the part most other sci-fi films skip, the process of learning a language without somebody who already knows both languages and can act as an intermediary. In doing so, according to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, it influences her thoughts, allowing her to see the future.
There's this idea in linguistics called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is the idea that the language you speak shapes your thought processes. It may even determine or set limits on what ideas it is possible for you to have, what kind of thoughts you can think.
That was Ted Chiang, writer of the short story Arrival was based on.
I think it's an interesting question to think about how much might learning or speaking another language actually influence how you think about the world. When it comes to learning an alien language, I think all bets are off.
And that was linguistics consultant on Arrival, Jessica Kuhn. Currently dealing with the fallout of an alien invasion across multiple continents, Louise uses her newfound skills to prevent a new form of mutually assured destruction. Meanwhile, on a more personal level, she's meeting the person that she will end up having a child with. She eventually finds out that this child will be terminally ill and dies at a young age. But instead of getting discouraged and choosing to change things, she decides to go through with it anyways. Is it really ironic that you would watch a movie knowing the end, when the story itself is about knowing how it will end and choosing to go through with it anyways? Isn't that just like the main theme? Also, Arrival plays with lighting in a fun way. In scenes in the tent with only humans, cinematographer Bradford Young pushed how dark he could make it before it would be too dark. It symbolizes the unknown. It's meant to contrast the scenes with the aliens. You see humans move from a place of unknown and uncertainty to speak with beings who know everything. They're even shrouded in a wall of light. When Louise finally figures out what's happening, she's in the room of light with them. In several discussions about Arrival, Fermat's principle of least time comes up, and I never understood it. I was basically like, what is this discussion about a variational principle doing in my Blu-ray extras? First off, Fermat's principle is an equation that describes the path a ray of light takes when traveling between 2 points through multiple mediums. For example, like a ray of light hitting the surface of water and refracting. The moment I understood it was while reading the short story Arrival was based on, the story of your life. For context, this was shortly after explaining that the heptapods would need to understand how an entire sentence structure would be laid out before they could even start the first stroke. Also in the story, the first breakthrough in communications with the aliens on a mathematical level was with Fermat's principle. Louise has a conversation. In it, Ian explains, "You're used to thinking of refraction in terms of cause and effect. Reaching the water surface is the cause, and the change in the direction is the effect. Fermat's principle sounds weird because it describes light's behavior in goal-oriented terms." He explains that, unlike most formulations of physical laws, variational principles are purposive, almost teleological. Don't look this word up though, I think this video can give you a better understanding of it than any definition. But I'll get back to this later. Ian anthropomorphized the light and described how it would need to know its destination, as well as details about its path before it set out in order to take the shortest path. If you think about the heptapod as the light, and the path as the actions it's taking, or even the sentence it's writing, the similarities become a lot more apparent. This was the first breakthrough because it was a variational principle.
With variational principles, you can describe physical phenomena by picking two endpoints, the state of a system at the beginning of a period of time and the state of the system at the end of that period of time. Then from that, you can deduce the behavior of that system during that period.
If you consider how Fermat's principle requires prior knowledge of 2 points and how that affects our other stories, it becomes especially relevant when we talk about Mr. Nobody. In Mr. Nobody, the whole story has the idea of omniscience at its very core, somehow being simultaneously the most relevant to our discussion and the thematic counterpoint. Exploring the life stories of Nemo Nobody, a boy who was born omniscient. The story is primarily told from the perspective of an old man looking back on his life with a faulty memory, and the story he tells is inconsistent. There are multiple incidences where he contradicts himself, and the popular opinion seems to be that he makes every possible decision and that he chooses every choice. Subjectivity of film aside, I believe this interpretation is incorrect. Even though the movie only shows Nemo avoiding one decision in a pivotal scene where after his parents' divorce, he's forced to choose between staying with his father or moving away with his mother. Instead of making a decision, young Nemo realizes that he can break the fabric of reality if he runs away. I believe the movie is saying that the man we see at the end is one that never made any meaningful decisions. As a result of his omniscience, he was unable to make a choice. Him not making a choice leads to him becoming the last mortal on Earth to die. Simultaneously, we see Nemo's death and the Big Crunch, a hypothetical scenario about the end of the universe that reverses time, entropy, and the expansion of the universe, eventually recollapsing it. For the purposes of Mr. Nobody, it's essentially a giant reset button. When I think about why Nemo might run away, it starts to make a lot of sense. Let me explain. So if you're someone who sees all your life pass, and each decision you make adds another lifetime to your perceived existence, overwhelming you with alternate realities, you might seek an end to your suffering, and you certainly wouldn't want to add to the noise. Your only option becomes not choosing anything. At one point, the movie uses a German chess term, Zugzwang.
And this is an example of one. The right move here is the absolutely fascinating rook to h6.
It describes a situation in which the obligation to make a move is disadvantageous. It's basically a situation where your best option is not to move.
Anything that you do will result in the loss of something. Essentially, if the bishop moves to any square, we play rook takes pawn, checkmate. But what if black takes our rook? Well, then we use the cleared out g7 square to push our pawn, and black is checkmated.
This is very much the philosophy of Nemo Nobody. Overwhelmed by the choices he's being forced to make, despite knowing everything, he is still unable to make a choice. He looks back and he regrets it. That's why he's laughing at the end, because he gets a free ride. He gets to go back and do things differently. Alrighty, now that the plot synopsis is out of the way, now the real fun can begin. An interesting concept that's explored by all of these is how the thing that gives us meaning, and the thing that drives even an omniscient being, is the decisions they make. Often, the very thing that defines who they are is what they choose to do, and what they choose not to. In another film called Waking Life, philosopher David Sosa addresses the conflict between determinism and free will. He explains that your individuality comes down to the choices that you make, that you can only be held responsible or be admired or respected for decisions you make of your own free will. He then describes how every process, even the choices you make, are governed by fundamental physical laws. He then proposes that quantum mechanics might provide some needed chaos into the system that might explain free will. But when you look at the details, it doesn't necessarily make you feel any better. He asks, would you rather be a gear in a deterministic system or the product of some swerving of subatomic particles? So even if you can't understand free will, it's important to make room for it. I like the idea that knowing everything doesn't devalue morality, that it actually encourages you to be kind to people. It instills you with a sense of responsibility. It makes you appreciate and respect the people around you. In another scene from Waking Life, Eamon Healy, a chemistry professor, discusses what he calls the telescopic nature of the evolutionary paradigm. He proposes the creation of neo-humans, a manifestation of humans' cooperation with AI aided by neurobiology. They could cause drastic changes to our evolutionary processes. This new evolutionary paradigm would not be cold and sterile like the one from the past, but would be altruistic with human morality at its core. He proposes with the aid of AI, evolution will continue to speed up. It may even get to the point where it manifests itself within a single lifetime. At that point, evolutionary processes would no longer be a thing centered around species or populations, but would be rather centered on individuals. At that point, it could amplify individual existences, even giving us access to parallel existences, freeing us of our perceived restrictions of time and space. Ultimate knowledge can often cause an existential crisis and a paradigm shift, resulting in the restructuring of priorities. It can often lead you to see things from a more teleological perspective. Alright, back to that word. Teleology is a way of explaining situations in terms of their purpose rather than what caused them to happen. It describes how an omniscient being might think. Once you can see everything, it becomes less important why something exists and more important what effect that thing has. I feel like there's a sort of experience that we can liken to what it might feel like. We call it hindsight. In Arrival, the aliens are the embodiment of this school of thought. In an interview, screenwriter Eric Kaiser explains the aliens' motivations.
Costello says, we're here to return the favor because 3,000 years from now you help us. And that's just the way they think, you know. They don't necessarily put one piece before the other chronologically the way we do.
The very narrative structure of Arrival is teleological. The script was written backwards. The same could be true for this essay. Despite multiple drafts, the last few sentences have largely remained the same. The fact that this definition is more easily understood with the aid of film demonstrates its ability to articulate abstract concepts that are at the edge of humans' understanding, and it's part of the reason why I love film. When we think about what an alien language might be like, and how aliens might think, so much is possible. At one point, Louise is breaking down why she's teaching the aliens to read. She explains that the aliens might have motivations so instinctual that they wouldn't understand a why question at all. The interesting thing is, she's not far off, it's just in the other direction. The aliens know so much, not only do they understand why, but they embody the teleological perspective. They're motivated by a distant goal. Essentially, their language is the key to prescience. It's a tool, and they're here to gift it to the human race. What I find interesting is from a variational principles perspective, prescience isn't impossible.
The laws of physics are all what they call time symmetric. You could reverse the arrow of time in all physical equations and it remains the same. So at a fundamental physical level, there isn't a difference between the past and the future.
In the physics that we know and the mathematics that we know around that physics, it's quite often just as easy to predict the future as it is to know the past. So it's something that's a conceivable possibility that a brain, a way of thinking about things could be set up where it's really as familiar with the things that it can predict in the future as it is the things that it knows from the past.
That was scientific consultant on Arrival, Stefan Wolfman. When talking about this, the discussion should become relative to our own experience. Instead of it being an outward discussion about what it must be like to experience something we can't comprehend, it should become an inward discussion about why we experience things the way we do. Why do we remember the past and not the future? In the Blu-ray for Arrival, Ted Chiang proposes a theory that memory is a process that entails an increase in entropy, and that is why we are only able to remember the past. These movies ask you to consider the social and cultural ramifications of omniscience, and I think it's a valid concern to wonder whether or not it's desirable or even beneficial for an individual to possess that kind of knowledge. Louise, arguably the least omniscient out of them all, is still put into a position where she has to make some seriously difficult decisions. Evelyn, for another example, becomes torn between her own life and that of a life where she became a movie star. Interestingly, the more powerful the character is, the more obvious this issue becomes. Case in point, Jobu. She was pushed beyond her limits to the point where she, much like Alpha Waymond, was looking for someone whose powers rival her own, but not to kill her, just to see if they could show her another way. Mr. Nobody, as the counterpoint, is the most omniscient and the least content. He constantly lives in regret for what could have been. He thinks he doesn't exist. He insists he's dreaming and that he's somewhere else, longing to wake up. Arrival and Everything Everywhere have us watch the characters become omniscient throughout most of the movie. Each film has its own rules and limitations as well. In Everything Everywhere All at Once, omniscience is limited in that the one constant throughout all the universes is time, and it continues to flow in the original even while you're elsewhere. Everything everywhere is happening all at once, and if you're somewhere else, it requires all of your attention, leaving you on autopilot in the original. Fun fact, one of the directors, Daniel Kwan, during the writing of this movie, realized that he had ADHD.
One of the weirdest things about this movie is like I was writing this movie and I was like, I think the main character probably should have like undiagnosed ADHD. I think it just makes sense. So I started doing research because I wanted to do it right, you know? And then like, you know, at 4 in the morning, I'm like crying in my bed and like, I think I have undiagnosed ADHD. And it's funny, but I think at one point someone asked, why is suicide in both of these films, and why are these like, it's so fun, it's so, you know, playful, why are we putting these things in? And like I'm only realizing it now that I have been diagnosed and I've been going to therapy and, you know, I've gone to a psychiatrist and like I'm in a much better place now. I'm a much happier human being. I'm a much, you know, it's like, come on, mental health is amazing, guys. When you can get the help and put a label on the thing that's been haunting you your whole life, I'm realizing, I was like, oh, this whole time, these really dark thoughts and this really deep depression that you saw in Swiss Army Man and that you see in the character of Joy, I'm realizing now, I was like, oh, I can put a name on that now. This is not a scary thing anymore. This is, it's like the first step towards, you know, basically building out a version of myself that doesn't have to be afraid of those thoughts. So, I don't know. We'll see what the next movie makes me realize about myself. You know, it's like, it's kind of, I don't know, I'm so lucky that I get to work out this trauma and stuff like that on the big screen. You know, it's like bizarre, but I'm glad you connected with it all.
It feels weird calling this a fun fact, but this is the same beautiful brain that gave us this movie, so screw it, I'm going with it. Also, from the wise words of the other director, Daniel Scheinert.
What I hope we can do while talking about our movie, celebrate the, like, there's cons, but there's pros to an atypical brain. And it's so incredible what comes out of Dan's brain. And like so many great artists aren't neurally typical. Yeah. And I just want them to feel less shame about it.
When hearing Daniel Kwan talk about his experience with ADHD, I believe this would be an example of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Another example would be our discussion about the meaning of the word teleological, or even our discussion about ikigai. You can experience a deeper understanding of even your own language that allows you to, on some level, think differently. Also, the directing style is so wholesome, but don't take it from me, just listen to Ki Hoi Kwan.
I'll tell this story. On day 2 of shooting, I got opposing notes from Daniel and Dan Kwan. They both give me very different notes. And I looked at them and I didn't know which one, you know, and then they were so cute. They go, Pete, will you excuse us? And I see them both walk off the set and then them just talking, and come back 5 minutes later. He says, Pete, this is what we want you to do.
Arrival is similar to Everything Everywhere in that when we see Louise flashing through different times, her attention is elsewhere. Instead of traveling through multiple universes like Everything Everywhere, she's remembering her future. One thing that's notably different about Louise is she sees a singular future, and if she chooses to make a change, she might strip herself of her abilities. Also, one thing I found interesting, it was a quote from Denis Villeneuve. For heptapods, life is like a play, of which they know the entire story until the end. They can either embrace every moment of it, or live through it on automatic pilot. There's also an interesting idea with these films, where you're limited to the perspective of your own body traveling through a higher dimension, whether that dimension is time, like Arrival, or multiple universes, like Everything Everywhere All at Once. In the short story for Arrival, Louise says that even though she can see the future, she can't see past her own death. And in that case, you could say the same is true for Mr. Nobody. Unlike the other films, Nemo is not limited to his own perspective. He is truly omniscient in that he even knows what will happen to other people. For example, like this accident with his father, where Nemo pulls a Birdman before it was cool. Or even when, where, and how someone will die, like his stepfather.
It will happen on a Saturday. You will be behind the wheel of your car. You are whistling. You do not see the crossroads. All of a sudden, a train will appear from your left, and you will be crushed.
There's even a scene where he says the biggest mistake he ever made was choosing to buy a cheaper pair of pants because it led to him losing the number to a woman he fell in love with.
An unemployed Brazilian boiled an egg. The heat created a
microclimate in the room and heavy rain. 2 months later, on the other side of the world, he will have lost his job in a clothing factory because 6 months earlier, I will have compared the prices of jeans and I will have bought the cheaper pair.
He is so omniscient that he is able to live to 118, but in order to get to that point, he has to become nobody. These movies are also sort of a commentary on the internet. Think about my next statement both in and out of context of this video. There's a way in which you have easy access to near unlimited knowledge. However, you're constantly bombarded by overwhelming levels of information, so much so that you can no longer pay attention to everything. You have to prioritize what you find important. You might think knowing the future makes it predetermined, but that's not the case. Knowing what will happen doesn't take away your agency. On the contrary, it gives you the power to choose to change it. It just makes the decisions you do make have that much more meaning. I like the idea that a fully omniscient being would know every possible choice you could make and account for them. It kind of acts as an argument against determinism. It makes room for you as an individual to still have meaningful choices. The Griffin character from Men in Black 3 is pretty much the embodiment of this, as he is aware of every reality, but what occurs is greatly influenced by the character's small decisions.
He's a fifth-dimensional being. They can live in and visualize an infinite set of time-space probabilities simultaneously.
D&D, for example, is a game predicated on a similar idea. There might be this dungeon master and they might have a goal and we might all be heading there, but how we get there is largely influenced by the choices that the characters make. A dungeon master would be a good example of somebody who has to try and think teleologically. There are some other choices matters games that are similar, like Detroit Become Human, for example. The first time I played that game, I felt this awe and wonder. I wanted to replay it again immediately. But the more I played it, the more I felt like this omniscient being just pulling everyone's strings and manipulating the story. At the center of these three films about crazy sci-fi concepts, they all choose to ground the films in a way that explores the connections between the characters and the people in their life. It engendered a greater appreciation for those in my life. This just makes me think of Hannah though, and what would have happened if Louise chose not to have her. Even if she was only here for a short time, she definitely had an impact nonetheless. I mean, she was even able to motivate her creation from an entirely different time. It's really moving though that the message seems to be that love, despite the loss, can allow us to accept and even transcend the finality of life. If you know there will be great joy in your life, but it will be fleeting, temporary, and leave you broken, do you choose to go through with it anyways? Whether it's through the regret of an old man filled with joy at the idea of a second chance, or a woman choosing an unsuccessful life with the family over a successful one without one, or even a woman choosing to have a child despite knowing they will die far too young. The way these films answer that question is with a resounding yes. If you like this video and you want to see more from me, I don't have to tell you what you need to do. Come on, you're smart, you already know. I do plan on releasing some more content like this in the future. It may take some time as I'm still learning how to do it all efficiently. Meanwhile though, I have a bunch of playlists of similar content that I love on my channel page. If that will not suffice and you must see more content from me, consider checking out this playlist. It's a D&D campaign where a group of friends and I get together and play every week. I play a robot who loves nature. He sees the world uniquely and we love him for that.